Close your eyes and imagine waking in a world utterly unlike our own. The year is not fixed in your calendar, because the calendar is set not by centuries or decades, but by dynasties, great houses of emperors whose names will echo through history. Tang, Song, Ming, Qing. Each dynasty rises like a sun and falls like a storm, yet for the common people, life remains a circle of labor, obedience, and survival. Above it all stands the Son of Heaven, the Emperor. He does not rule as a man, but as a living bridge between heaven and earth. His word can raise a city or erase a family line. Beneath him stretches a vast hierarchy, scholar officials trained in Confucian texts, local magistrates who wield both pen and whip, military commanders guarding restless frontiers, and finally, at the very bottom, the endless sea of peasants who till the fields. This is a land where status is not chosen but imposed. A farmer cannot dream of becoming a noble. A merchant may drown in silver yet remain despised. The order of society is like a wall of stone, immovable and unquestioned, guarded by ritual, tradition, and law. The grandeur of palaces and jade carvings hides a truth. Most of the empire's millions live in mud-walled huts, bound to the soil, their lives dictated by taxes, floods, or the will of officials they may never meet. To live in Imperial China is to live inside a machine built of obedience and fear, where the individual is nothing and the empire is everything. Welcome then to Imperial China, a world dazzling in beauty, terrifying in order, and merciless to those who step out of place. In Imperial China, power was never just power, it was sacred. The emperor ruled not because he was strongest, nor because he was cleverest, but because the heavens themselves had chosen him. This divine approval was known as the mandate of heaven. Imagine looking up at the night sky, seeing endless stars glimmer above. To the people, those stars were not distant suns, but signs, whispers from heaven about whether their ruler was just. A good harvest, steady rivers, and peace on the borders meant the emperor's rule was blessed. But a famine, a flood, or a rebellion, these were not mere accidents of nature. They were warnings. Heaven was displeased. The mandate of heaven was both powerful and fragile. It gave one man the right to command millions, but it could also be stripped away in a heartbeat. When dynasties fell, as they always did, it was never said that men had overthrown them. Instead, it was heaven that had withdrawn its favor. The emperor became not a son of heaven, but a usurper whose time had ended. For the common people, this belief was both hope and fear. If their suffering grew unbearable, they could whisper that perhaps heaven was on their side, that rebellion might succeed because the mandate had passed. Yet until that moment, obedience was law, for to disobey was not only treason against the emperor, but defiance of heaven itself. The empire rested on this fragile thread, an invisible contract between sky and earth, emperor and people. And so, each sunrise in Imperial China was not just another day, it was a question. Did heaven still favor the ruler? And if not, who would dare to rise when the stars themselves seem to say the time has come? Step into Imperial China, and the first thing you notice is its staggering contrasts. This is a civilization of breathtaking beauty and crushing hardship, where silk and gold shimmer in palaces, while hunger gnaws in the countryside. In the capital, wide boulevards echo with the sound of hooves and sedan chairs. Nobles in embroidered robes glide past shopfronts selling lacquerware, porcelain, and exotic spices. Musicians pluck zithers in courtyards perfumed with incense. To walk here is to feel as though the empire itself is eternal, wealthy beyond measure, untouchable in its splendor. But beyond the city walls, life is different. The farther you travel, the narrower the roads become, until they are only dirt paths cut by cartwheels and rain. Mud brick houses lean against one another, their roofs patched with straw. Families rise before dawn to till fields that will never truly belong to them. Grain harvested with bleeding hands must be surrendered as tax before their own bowls can be filled. This was China's truth, a vast empire balanced between glittering centers of wealth and the unending toil of the villages that fed them. The palace feasts, with their dozens of dishes, were possible only because countless peasants lived on millet gruel. The silks that draped nobles were woven by unseen hands, raw fingers pulling threads for pennies. To be born into privilege was to glimpse heaven on earth. To be born outside of it was to carry the empire's weight on your back. And there was no escape, no ladder to climb. The wall between rich and poor was as high and unyielding as the Great Wall itself. Imagine walking toward the heart of Beijing, where crimson walls rise like mountains of stone and gold. Behind them lies a world that almost no ordinary person would ever see, the Forbidden City. For centuries, this palace complex was the beating heart of the empire, the place where emperors ruled as sons of heaven. Its very name tells the story. Forbidden, because for peasants, merchants, and even most nobles, stepping inside these walls without permission meant death. The gates were guarded by soldiers in bright armor, their spears glinting in the sun. Within, courtyards stretched endlessly, paved with stone that had been dragged across mountains by human labor. Roofs gleamed with yellow tiles, the imperial color that no one else dared to wear. Dragons curled across beams and stairways, reminding all who entered that this was not merely a palace, but the axis of the universe. Inside, life was as suffocating as it was splendid. Officials bowed until their foreheads touched the floor, waiting hours for a single glance from the emperor. Eunuchs whispered in corridors, carrying secrets that could end careers or save lives. Concubines lived in silken chambers, but also in fear, for beauty could win favor, but favor could vanish overnight. Yet the Forbidden City was not a place of laughter or ease. It was a gilded cage, even for the emperor himself. He could command millions, but he could not walk beyond those walls like a free man. Every step, every ritual, every word was bound by tradition and surveillance. For the ordinary people outside, the Forbidden City was a symbol of divine majesty, but also of distance. It reminded them that power was not only unreachable, it was untouchable. The palace was not built to welcome its subjects, but to keep them forever outside, gazing at walls they would never cross. And so the Forbidden City was less a home and more a theater, where emperors and courtiers played roles in a ritual that kept the empire alive, a world of whispers and golden shadows, hidden from the millions who labored to sustain it. Stretch your imagination to the northern horizon, where stone snakes across mountains and deserts, vanishing into mist. This is the Great Wall of China, one of humanity's most staggering constructions. To us it is a wonder. To those who built it, it was a sentence of sweat, hunger, and death. For emperors, the wall was more than stone, it was survival. From the north came horse-riding nomads, fierce, swift, and unpredictable. To hold them back, dynasties poured endless labor into this barrier. Peasants, soldiers, and criminals alike were dragged into service, hauling stones by hand, stacking bricks under the burning sun or the bitter wind. Many never returned. Their bones became part of the wall itself, buried beneath its foundations. From a distance, the wall was majesty incarnate, but for those stationed there, life was misery. Soldiers patrolled desolate stretches where winters froze their blood and summers seared their skin. Supplies were scarce, raids constant, and loneliness unbearable. To serve on the wall was to stare at emptiness, knowing that beyond the horizon were enemies, and behind you was an empire that barely remembered you. And yet, the Great Wall was never just about enemies. It was about control. It reminded the people of the emperor's reach, his power to shape the land itself. It was a message carved into stone. Here begins China, and beyond this line lies chaos. For common people, the wall symbolized both pride and sorrow, pride in its vastness, sorrow in its cost. And beyond it, the steppe stretched endlessly, reminding all that no wall, no matter how high, could truly keep the empire safe. In Imperial China, even the horizon was a boundary, a reminder that the empire was both magnificent and fragile, eternal in dreams, but always at risk of being shattered by the world beyond its walls. To understand Imperial China, you must first understand its rigid social ladder. Society was not fluid, not negotiable. It was carved like stone. Every person was placed in one of 4 classes, and there they would remain for life. At the very top stood the scholars, or the literati. They were not warriors, nor merchants, nor farmers, but thinkers steeped in the wisdom of Confucius. To them fell the privilege of government service, their ink-stained fingers commanding armies and taxes alike. Knowledge was their crown, and the emperor their son. Beneath them came the farmers, the backbone of the empire. Though poor, they were respected, for they fed the nation. Their lives were chains of dawn to dusk toil, their reward little more than survival. Yet Confucian ideals placed them higher than those who merely traded wealth. Next were the artisans, skilled hands shaping wood, clay, silk, and jade. They lived in the shadows of cities, crafting beauty for others, but never themselves. They were neither honored nor despised, useful, yet never celebrated. At the very bottom stood the merchants. Ironically, they were often the richest, yet their wealth brought them no honor. To Confucian eyes, they produced nothing. They merely moved what others had made, and so they were tolerated, but distrusted, their silver, unable to buy respect. This ladder was not meant to be climbed. It was a wall, unyielding, unforgiving. A farmer might dream of becoming a scholar, but without education, the dream dissolved at sunrise. An artisan's son remained an artisan. A merchant's grandson still carried his grandfather's stigma. In Imperial China, you were not simply born, you were placed. Your destiny was mapped the moment you took your first breath, and to step beyond it was not ambition, it was rebellion. If you were born in Imperial China, chances are overwhelming that you would be a farmer. Not a wealthy landowner, not a noble, not a scholar, but a peasant, bound to the soil as tightly as the roots of the rice you planted. Your day would begin long before sunrise. The rooster's call was not a choice, but a command. You would step barefoot onto damp earth, carrying tools carved from wood and iron, your back already aching before the work began. Fields stretched endlessly, yet none of it was truly yours. The emperor owned the land, or perhaps a landlord or magistrate. You were only a caretaker, condemned to sow and reap, but never to claim. Hunger was your closest companion. Some years the harvest was good, and you might eat rice, perhaps even meat on festival days. But in lean years, meals shrank to thin porridge, sometimes mixed with husks or grass. Your children's stomachs swelled, not with plenty, but with emptiness. And always there were taxes. Grain carts rumbled away each season, filled not for your family, but for the empire. Even when floods drowned your crops or locusts devoured your fields, the tax collector still arrived. To resist meant punishment, and punishment in Imperial China was swift and merciless. Yet, life was not entirely without light. In the village, festivals brought drums, lanterns, and laughter. You might burn incense to ancestors, hoping for protection, or listen to traveling storytellers spin tales of heroes. But joy was brief, always overshadowed by the next planting, the next harvest, the next demand from above. To be a farmer in Imperial China was to live on the edge of survival, carrying the weight of an empire on shoulders that never rested. Without you, the empire would starve. Yet with you, the empire never cared if you starved first. In Imperial China, few dreams burned brighter than that of becoming a scholar official. For the son of a humble family, this was the single narrow bridge from mud to silk, from obscurity to honor. But the path was as brutal as it was alluring. The imperial examination system was the gatekeeper. To pass, a boy would spend years bent over bamboo slips and paper, memorizing the words of Confucius until they were etched deeper than breath. He would rise before dawn reciting verses, practicing calligraphy, drilling essays that demanded not originality, but obedience to tradition. If he succeeded, if his brush flowed without error and his memory never faltered, doors opened. He might be summoned to court, clothed in fine robes, seated among officials who shaped the empire itself. His family, once invisible, would bask in reflected glory. A single pass could lift generations. But for everyone who rose, thousands failed. The exams were merciless, lasting days held in tiny cells where candidates ate, slept, and wrote alone. Ink smudges, a misremembered phrase or trembling nerves could destroy years of preparation. For many, failure was not just disappointment, but disgrace. Families poured savings into their sons' education, and a failed scholar returned home as a burden, his dreams shattered like broken porcelain. Those who succeeded were celebrated as the empire's brightest lights, yet even they were chained by duty. Their loyalty was not to truth, but to the emperor. Their brilliance was harnessed to uphold the system, never to question it. The scholar elite lived in honor, but also in fear, fear of losing favor, of writing the wrong word, of being caught in court intrigues that could end in exile or execution. Their ink gave them power, but it also bound them to a life where every stroke had the weight of life and death. To be a scholar was to stand high above the masses, yet to live every day knowing that one mistake could send you crashing back into obscurity. Or worse, in most civilizations, money buys respect. But in Imperial China, it bought only suspicion. At the bottom of society, ladder stood the merchants, men who might overflow with silver, yet were still considered parasites in the eyes of Confucian order. Why? Because merchants created nothing. They did not plough fields like farmers, nor craft beauty like artisans, nor master wisdom like scholars. They merely moved goods from one place to another, profiting from the work of others. To Confucian minds, this was dishonorable. And yet merchants thrived. The markets of China bustled with silk, porcelain, tea, and spices. Caravans trudged across deserts to the west. Ships sailed from southern ports to faraway kingdoms. Behind the empire's proud exports were merchants, calculating, bargaining, growing rich in shadows where officials looked down their noses. But wealth without honor was a dangerous gift. A merchant might build a mansion finer than a scholar's, yet still be denied respect at banquets. His children could not easily marry into noble families. His fortune might attract officials' jealousy, leading to heavy taxes or sudden confiscation. At any moment, his empire of trade could be swept away by decree. So many merchants sought survival through disguise. They bought land, hoping to pass as gentlemen farmers. They sponsored their sons' education, praying one might pass the imperial exams and raise the family into true respectability. Silver was a weapon, but it could never pierce the armor of Confucian hierarchy. To live as a merchant was to walk a tightrope, admired in secret, scorned in public, trapped in a role that wealth alone could never escape. In Imperial China, a woman's life was written before she could even speak. Her worth was measured not by her dreams, but by her obedience, first to her father, then to her husband, and finally in old age to her son. From childhood, girls were taught the 3 obediences and the 4 virtues: to obey men in every stage of life, to remain modest, chaste, silent, and diligent. A woman's world was her household, and beyond its walls, her presence was often unseen, her voice unheard. But the expectations went deeper, carved into flesh itself. Among the elite, foot-binding twisted young girls' feet into tiny lotus-like shapes, breaking bones to make them beautiful. To walk became agony, but beauty and marriage demanded it. A woman with bound feet was considered delicate, desirable, and trapped. Marriage was not romance but duty. Brides were chosen through family arrangements, often never meeting their husbands until the wedding day. Once married, a woman's primary role was to bear sons, for only sons could continue the family line and honor the ancestors. Daughters, though loved, were seen as temporary, destined to leave, to serve another household. Yet women's lives were not without quiet strength. Mothers guided households with patience and wisdom, weaving the fabric of daily life. In rural villages, women toiled beside men in fields, carrying the same burdens but receiving none of the recognition. And within the palace, concubines and empresses wielded influence through whispers and alliances, shaping history from behind silk screens. Still, the cage remained. To be a woman in Imperial China was to live in a world where freedom was a dream, beauty was pain, and silence was survival. If you sat down at the table in Imperial China, what you ate would tell your story more clearly than any words. For the emperor, meals were banquets, dozens of dishes of roasted meats, rare fruits, delicate dumplings, and teas scented with flowers. For the common people, however, food was not abundance but survival. The peasant's bowl held mostly grains, millet in the north, rice in the south. Sometimes the grains were boiled into thick porridge, sometimes stretched thin into watery gruel. Vegetables filled the gaps when they were in season. Meat was a luxury, perhaps tasted once or twice a year, on festival days or weddings. Eggs, tofu, or beans might add protein when they could be afforded. But famine was never far away. A single flood, drought, or locust swarm could strip the land bare. Families boiled weeds, chewed on bark, or ground husks into flour just to survive. In desperate times, records tell of parents selling children, or worse, consuming food that no one should ever eat. And yet, even in hunger, food was tied to ritual. Offerings were placed before ancestral tablets, incense smoke curling around bowls of rice, meat, or wine. To honor the dead, even the poorest family would share from their meager stores. To eat in imperial China was to balance on a knife's edge. The emperor's table groaned with abundance, while the farmer's table often sat nearly empty. The empire was fed by millions, but most of those who fed it lived closer to hunger than to fullness. In this world, every grain of rice was precious, every meal uncertain. Food was not comfort, it was a reminder of how fragile life truly was. Imagine being thirsty in imperial China. You walk to the nearest well or river, scoop up the water and drink. But in that cup, unseen, lurks danger. There were no filters, no boiling for most families, no way to know if the water carried life or death. In villages, rivers served every purpose at once. People washed clothes, bathed, fished, and dumped waste into the same currents. Wells, when dug, could be shallow and easily contaminated by nearby latrines or refuse. Parasites, bacteria, and diseases spread quietly, turning something as simple as a sip of water into a gamble. Sanitation, as we understand it, did not exist. In cities, chamber pots were emptied into alleys, their contents carried off in carts to be used as night soil in the fields. The stench of summer streets was overwhelming, buzzing with flies, breeding illness in every shadow. Sewage flowed where children played. Epidemics were not rare but expected, cutting through families with merciless speed. For the wealthy, life was only a little cleaner. In the palaces, ornate bronze vessels held water, and servants fetched fresh supplies daily. Perfumes and incense masked smells, but even there disease crept through. The empire's doctors prescribed herbs, charms, and acupuncture, but no cure could erase the risk that came with every swallow of water. To live in imperial China was to share your home with sickness. The people did not speak of hygiene as we do today. Illness was fate, punishment, or imbalance, not something that could be washed away with soap. And so every drink, every breath carried a reminder. Life was fragile, and the simplest act, quenching thirst, was never safe. In imperial China, what you wore and where you lived told the world exactly who you were. Society announced itself through fabric and walls, and there was little room to hide your station. For the peasants, clothing was simple and rough, hemp or cotton robes, patched and repatched until the fabric thinned to threads. Feet were often bare in the fields, sandals tied with straw when possible. Winter meant layering whatever scraps were at hand, yet still shivering in the biting wind. A farmer's clothing was not fashion, but survival. The wealthy elite, however, wrapped themselves in silks that shimmered like flowing water. Embroidered dragons, phoenixes, and clouds danced across robes dyed in colors forbidden to commoners. Yellow, the imperial hue, was reserved for the emperor alone. To wear it without permission was to risk execution. Clothes were more than comfort. They were law, woven with the threads of hierarchy. And then there was shelter. Most peasants lived in mud brick huts, their roofs thatched with straw, walls cracked by rain and heat. Inside, space was cramped. Smoke from cooking fires blackened ceilings. Warmth was scarce in winter, and pests were constant companions. Wealthy households, by contrast, dwelled in timber-framed courtyards, tiled roofs curving like waves, gardens perfumed with blossoms, and painted screens dividing airy rooms. The contrast was so stark that walking into a city could feel like stepping into another universe. The same empire held both palaces of carved jade and villages where families slept shoulder to shoulder on straw mats. For most, life was lived in the shadows of poor walls and ragged clothes, constant reminders of their place in the order of things. In imperial China, your garments and your home did not simply protect you, they revealed you, binding you visibly to your rank in a world where appearance was destiny. If hunger and hardship weighed on the peasants of imperial China, nothing pressed heavier than the tax. To be born a farmer was to be born into debt, not to a neighbor, not to a lender, but to the empire itself. Taxes came in many forms. Most common was the grain tax. Each harvest, carts creaked down village lanes, collecting rice, millet, or wheat. Families stacked their best bundles aside, not for their own children but for officials who demanded them in the emperor's name. Even in famine years, when fields yielded little more than weeds, the tax collector still arrived. Then there was the labor tax, the corvée. When the empire needed walls built, canals dug, or roads repaired, peasants were summoned. Leaving behind their families and fields, they labored under scorching suns and freezing winds, often for months at a time. Their absence meant empty hands at home, a second tax of hunger for their wives and children. Silver taxes followed, especially in later dynasties. Merchants and farmers alike scrambled to find coins, often borrowing from moneylenders at crushing rates. Debt piled upon debt, binding families for generations. To resist was unthinkable. Officials carried whips, soldiers enforced decrees, and punishments were brutal. A missing sack of rice might mean lashes. A refusal could mean imprisonment or death. And yet, the taxes kept the empire alive. They fed armies, filled granaries, and funded palaces that peasants would never see. Every brick of the Great Wall, every banquet in the Forbidden City, every embroidered robe of a court official was paid for by sweat in the fields. For the common man, taxes were not numbers on a ledger. They were the difference between eating and starving, between life and death. In Imperial China, the taxman came not once a year, but every single day, through hunger, through labor, through fear. In Imperial China, life was not only ruled by emperors and officials, but by the whims of nature itself. For peasants, every year was a gamble with the sky and the river, a gamble they often lost. The land was fertile, but fragile. When the rains came too late, crops withered under a pitiless sun. When the rains came too heavy, floods swallowed entire villages, sweeping away homes, fields, and families in a single night. The mighty yellow river, called China's Sorrow, could shift its course without warning, drowning tens of thousands and leaving survivors in wastelands of mud. And then there was famine. With harvests ruined, markets emptied, and prices soared beyond reach. Families sold tools, livestock, even their children, just to buy a few handfuls of grain. In the darkest times, people boiled leather shoes, chewed bark, or scavenged weeds from roadside ditches. Some chronicles whisper of even grimmer choices, stories too bleak to linger on. For the emperor, disaster was more than tragedy. It was a political threat. A flood or famine was read as a sign that heaven's mandate was slipping away. Hungry people could endure hardship, but starving people rebelled. Rebellions often began not with swords, but with empty stomachs. And yet no dynasty ever found a true answer. Granaries were built, relief measures promised, but corruption siphoned supplies, and officials fattened themselves while villages starved. Nature struck again and again, indifferent to prayers, rituals, or imperial decrees. For the common man, survival meant living always on the edge, knowing that one season of bad rain could erase generations of labor. To live in Imperial China was to live at the mercy of heaven and earth, where a single storm could decide whether you ate tomorrow or whether your family's name was lost forever. When you look at China's wonders, the Great Wall, the Grand Canal, palaces rising like mountains of stone, it's easy to feel awe. But behind every stone lies a story not of glory, but of suffering. These monuments were built not by choice, but by forced labor. When the emperor decreed a project, there was no negotiation. Peasants were summoned from their villages, marched in long lines to construction sites hundreds of miles away. They left, behind their families and fields, knowing that their absence would mean hunger at home. Some never returned. The work was brutal. Men carried stone blocks up cliffs with ropes digging into their shoulders, dug canals knee-deep in freezing water, or hauled timber through swamps buzzing with disease. Food was scarce, punishment swift, and accidents common. A broken bone could mean abandonment. A missed quota could mean lashes. On the Great Wall, workers labored in searing heat and blizzards alike. Many died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or raids. Their bodies were said to be buried in the foundations themselves, a grim truth whispered as the world's longest graveyard. For the emperor, these projects were symbols of power. To the people, they were chains. The glittering palaces, the strong walls, the flowing canals, all were paid for with the sweat, blood, and lives of ordinary men who had no choice but to obey. In imperial China, greatness was built on the broken backs of the forgotten. And the empire never let its people forget who commanded their labor, not themselves, but the Son of Heaven. When the weight of hunger, taxes, and forced labor grew too heavy, peasants did the unthinkable. They rose. Rebellions in imperial China were not rare sparks, but roaring fires that erupted again and again across the centuries. Most began with whispers, a prophet declaring that heaven had withdrawn its mandate, a charismatic leader promising justice or simply bread. Villagers gathered with farm tools, bamboo spears, even bare fists, desperate enough to challenge the empire itself. The rebellions were born of misery, famines that left corpses on roadsides, floods that erased entire provinces, officials who grew fat while children starved. Hope became rebellion, rebellion became war. Some movements swelled to millions, carving scars into the empire. But the empire always struck back. Imperial armies marched with steel and fire, crushing villages, burning fields, and slaughtering rebels by the thousands. Punishments were brutal. Leaders were executed, families enslaved, villages erased from the map. Even whispers of sympathy could end a life. And yet rebellions left their mark. The Yellow Turban Uprising, the Red Turbans, the White Lotus, all were born from the desperation of peasants. Though most were crushed, some toppled dynasties entirely, proving that the greatest threat to an emperor was not a foreign invader, but his own starving people. For a common farmer, joining a revolt was a gamble. Stay home, and your family starved. Under taxes. Rise up and you risked execution. Either way, survival was uncertain. Imperial China's history was written not only by emperors and scholars, but also by peasants who dared, in their hunger, to grasp at destiny. Their rebellions were not just acts of defiance, they were cries from the earth itself demanding to be heard. In Imperial China, the emperor's power did not rest only on officials or taxes, it rested on armies, and those armies were filled, not by volunteers, but by ordinary men torn from their villages. When the call came, there was no refusal. A peasant might be seized from his field, handed a spear, and marched hundreds of miles to the frontier. Families wept as sons, husbands, and fathers disappeared into the ranks, often never to return. Life as a soldier was harsh beyond imagining. Rations were meager, a handful of rice, perhaps dried vegetables, sometimes nothing at all. Weapons were crude, armor scarce, training minimal. You might be stationed on the Great Wall, shivering through endless winters, or sent into jungles. In the south, your body eaten by insects before an enemy blade ever touched you. Battles were brutal, but so was idleness. Long stretches of waiting, cold nights under the stars, disease spreading faster than arrows. Soldiers often died not by the sword, but by fever, frostbite, or starvation. And for what reward? The promise of honor? For most, none came. Victories were claimed by generals, losses blamed on common men. Survivors returned to their villages scarred, sometimes crippled, only to find their fields overgrown, their families impoverished. Many never came home at all, their names lost in the empire's endless scrolls of the dead. For the emperor, conscription was a tool to defend the realm. For the soldier, it was a death sentence wrapped in duty. To be conscripted was not to serve. Willingly, it was to vanish into the empire's machine of war, your life consumed like grain in a fire. In Imperial China, the word justice did not mean fairness, it meant fear. Law was not a shield to protect the weak, but a sword to keep them silent. Confucian ideals spoke of harmony and order, but the empire maintained that order through punishment. Trials were swift, often mere formalities. Evidence could be a whisper from a neighbor, a bribe to an official, or a confession dragged out through pain. Torture was not the exception, it was the method. The accused were beaten with bamboo rods. Their bones cracked under heavy boards, their limbs twisted by ropes until joints popped from their sockets. Confessions won in agony were considered proof enough. To cry out your innocence under such torment was useless. Silence or screams, both, condemned you. The punishments themselves were meant to terrify. Thieves were flogged or branded. Corrupt officials were exiled to distant frontiers, cut off from family forever. More serious crimes brought amputation, strangulation, or beheading, and the gravest, treason, rebellion, defying the emperor, brought punishments so horrific they were spoken of only in shudders. But perhaps the cruelest truth was this: punishment extended beyond the guilty. If a man was accused of betraying the empire, his family, parents, wife, children, could be executed alongside him. Guilt was not personal, it was collective. This system was not designed for justice, it was designed for control. Every lash, every broken bone, every execution was a reminder to the millions below. The emperor ruled not by consent, but by terror. In Imperial China, justice did not blindfold itself. It stared directly at you, demanding submission, or offering suffering. In Imperial China, executions were not hidden behind prison walls. They were performed in open squares where crowds gathered, not only to witness death, but to learn obedience. The condemned were paraded through the streets, often bound and beaten. Their crimes written on wooden boards hung around their necks. The crowd jeered, wept, or watched in silence, knowing that one misstep in their own lives could place them on the same path. For lesser crimes, beheading was common, quick, but humiliating. Bodies were displayed, sometimes left for days as a warning. Others suffered strangulation, slow and suffocating, their families forbidden from claiming the body until the emperor decreed it. But for crimes of rebellion or treason, punishments grew far darker. The most feared was lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. Flesh sliced piece by piece as the crowd looked on in horror. It was not merely execution, it was spectacle, designed to etch terror into the memory of all who saw it. Executions were also political theater. Officials attended. In their fine robes, soldiers stood in formation. Drums beat and proclamations were read aloud. Each death was framed not as vengeance, but as proof that order was maintained, that heaven's mandate still shone on the emperor. For the common people, the message was clear. Life was not yours, but the empire's. To rebel, to steal, to question. Authority was to risk not only your own death, but the ruin of your family. And so fear lived in every heart. The execution ground was not just a place of death. It was the stage upon which the empire reminded its people that survival depended on silence, obedience, and submission. At the heart of Imperial China was not only the emperor's will, but a philosophy that shaped every breath of society: Confucianism. It was more than thought. It was the architecture of life itself. Confucius taught that harmony could be achieved if everyone knew their place. Father above son, husband above wife, ruler above subject, scholar above farmer. The empire embraced this teaching, weaving it into law, ritual, and education until it became unbreakable. To question the order was to question the very fabric of the world. A good man was not bold or rebellious, but obedient, respectful, and loyal. A good woman was modest, silent, and dutiful. A good subject bowed before authority, whether emperor or magistrate. Confucianism gave the empire stability, but also chains. The farmer bent his back in the field because he was told that to serve was noble. The woman endured silence because it was said that virtue demanded it. The scholar, though powerful, spent his brilliance not on innovation, but on preserving tradition. Schools taught not curiosity, but memorization. Children recited the classics until their tongues stumbled. To live well was not to live freely, but to conform, like one note in a vast symphony, perfectly in tune, never daring to improvise. Confucian order brought unity to a massive empire. It was the glue that held dynasties together, generation after generation. But for the individual, it meant that your life was not your own story. It was a role already written, and you were expected to perform it without flaw. In Imperial China, Confucianism was not simply philosophy. It was destiny, binding each person into an invisible web where obedience was survival and deviation was disaster. If Confucianism gave order to society, Taoism gave mystery to life. Where Confucius spoke of rules and duties, Taoism whispered of rivers, mountains, and the unseen currents that shaped the world. Taoism taught that the universe flowed like water, gentle yet unstoppable. To live well was not to fight against the current, but to yield, to bend, to move in harmony with the natural order called the Tao. This philosophy seeped into medicine, poetry, painting, and even governance. The quiet wisdom of Taoism softened the rigid iron of Confucian order. But alongside these lofty ideas thrived a world of superstition. Spirits were believed to dwell in forests, rivers, even doorways. Villagers hung charms above their homes to keep away demons, burned incense to ward off bad luck, and consulted fortune-tellers before planting crops or arranging marriages. A child's illness might be blamed on a restless ghost, a poor harvest on offended ancestors. The empire itself relied on omens. Eclipses, earthquakes, or strange stars in the sky were read as heaven's warnings. Emperors performed rituals to appease the heavens, while commoners lit lanterns and prayed for protection. Taoist priests wandered from village to village, casting spells, brewing elixirs, or performing rituals that promised to cure sickness or banish evil. Sometimes their remedies helped. Often they were only hope wrapped in incense smoke. But in a world where medicine was fragile and life uncertain, hope was power enough. Taoism and superstition gave peasants comfort when Confucian order gave none. They promised that unseen forces could be swayed, that harmony could be restored, that suffering was not meaningless. In Imperial China, people lived not only under the emperor's gaze, but also under the watchful eyes of spirits and stars, an invisible kingdom every bit as real as the empire itself. Among the many beliefs that shaped Imperial China, none carried such quiet, enduring weight as Buddhism. Arriving from India centuries earlier, it spread across temples, villages, and palaces until it became part of the empire's very soul. At its heart was the promise of karma, the idea that every action carried consequences, not only in this life, but in countless lives to come. To suffer in the present was not random misfortune, it was repayment for sins of the past. To live with kindness and patience was to plant seeds for a better rebirth. For peasants bent under endless toil, Buddhism offered a bittersweet comfort. Their suffering was explained, their hunger given meaning. Perhaps poverty today would mean wealth in the next life, if only they endured with humility. For the rich, temples offered another kind of salvation. Lavish donations of gold and land to the monks, meant to cleanse their sins and purchase merit for themselves and their ancestors. Monasteries rose as islands of quiet in a restless empire. Monks in saffron robes chanted sutras, carved statues of the Buddha, and tended incense that curled like prayers into the sky. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to see sacred relics or to hear words of wisdom that promised peace beyond the reach of emperors and officials. Yet Buddhism was not always safe. Some emperors saw monasteries as rivals to their power, ordering temples destroyed, statues melted down, and monks forced back into ordinary life. But the faith always returned, carried in whispers, prayers, and hidden altars. Buddhism gave people of Imperial China something rare, the hope that suffering was not the end, but a step on a longer journey. In a world where justice was harsh and life was short, karma was the promise that someday, in some life, balance would return. In Imperial China, the dead were never truly gone. They lived on, in shrines, in rituals, in every offering of incense. To honor one's ancestors was not simply tradition, it was duty, as sacred as serving the emperor himself. Every household, no matter how poor, kept a small altar. There, wooden tablets or slips of paper bore the names of the departed. Before them, bowls of rice, cups of tea, or sticks of incense were placed as offerings. Families bowed, prayed, and whispered hopes that their ancestors would bless them with health, harvest, or harmony. For the living, neglecting these rites was unthinkable. A child who failed to honor his parents after death brought shame upon himself and misfortune upon his family. To die without sons was a curse, for who would keep your memory alive? Thus, families longed for male heirs, not only to continue the bloodline, but to ensure that their spirits would not wander forgotten. Ancestor worship also bound society in invisible chains. It reminded each person that they were not individuals, but links in an unbroken chain stretching backward and forward. Through time, a man belonged not to himself, but to his ancestors and his descendants. Even the emperor was not exempt. Great rituals were held at ancestral temples, where he bowed before the spirits of past rulers, affirming that his authority flowed not only from heaven, but from the line of emperors before him. For the people of Imperial China, ancestors were not memories. They were guardians, judges, and companions. Their presence lingered in every meal, every festival, every decision. To live was to walk hand in hand with the dead, never alone, never free from their gaze. In Imperial China, life was not measured only by days and seasons, but by rituals. From the emperor in his palace to the poorest peasant in his hut, existence unfolded in ceremonies that bound the living to the past, the heavens, and each other. Every act, no matter how small, had its prescribed form. To bow before an elder, to greet an official, to offer incense at a shrine. Each gesture carried meaning. Even meals followed ritual. How one poured tea, how one held chopsticks, how one served a guest. Life was choreographed like a dance, and stepping out of rhythm risked shame or worse. At the highest level, rituals upheld the empire itself. The emperor performed grand sacrifices at the temple of heaven, kneeling before the vast sky to affirm his mandate. His prayers were not personal, they were for rain, for harvests, for the stability of the realm. If he faltered, it was said, heaven itself might turn away. In villages, rituals marked the passage of life. Birth celebrated with incense and charms, weddings sealed with offerings, funerals filled with wailing and firecrackers to scare away evil spirits. Even planting and harvesting had ceremonies, blessings whispered over the earth before seeds touched soil. Ritual was not empty form, it was the glue of society. It reminded each person of their place, their duty, their connection to the cosmos. To refuse a ritual was rebellion. To perform it was to affirm harmony. For the people of Imperial China, rituals were as necessary as food and water. They did not simply believe in order. They enacted it again and again in gestures as small as a bow and as vast as an emperor's sacrifice. In a world where survival was uncertain, rituals gave life rhythm, meaning, and the illusion, perhaps even the reality, of control over chaos. In Imperial China, death was not only found on battlefields or in execution grounds. It crept silently through villages, carried in breath, water, and rats. Epidemics and plagues were the empire's invisible enemies, striking without warning, killing without mercy. Smallpox scarred faces and stole children. Dysentery swept through. Towns, leaving the weak, collapsed by rivers. Malaria haunted the southern swamps, fevers burning men alive from within. And sometimes darker plagues arrived, strange illnesses that emptied villages in days, leaving fields silent, homes abandoned, and roads lined with corpses. Medical knowledge was limited, and superstition filled the gaps. Doctors prescribed herbs, acupuncture, and prayers. Families burned incense, hung charms, or invited Taoist priests to chase away evil spirits. Some remedies helped, but many did not. For most, survival depended not on medicine but on chance. When epidemics struck cities, fear spread faster than disease. Shops closed, people fled, corpses piled in streets. The poor died first, but the rich could not always escape. Disease ignored class, striking both huts and palaces alike. And yet plagues were not only tragedies, they were political earthquakes. A dynasty that could not protect its people from disease was seen as having lost heaven's mandate. Rumors grew, rebellions followed, and empires weakened. Sickness was not only personal suffering, it was a threat to the throne itself. For ordinary people, an epidemic was terror made daily. A cough, a fever, a swelling, any of these could be the beginning of the end. There were no hospitals, no cures, no certainty, only prayers, hope, and the grim acceptance that life in Imperial China was as fragile as a candle flickering in the wind. In a world where epidemics struck without warning, the people of Imperial China turned to the only defense they had, traditional medicine. It was not modern science, but a blend of philosophy, herbs, and faith, sometimes helpful, sometimes deadly, always uncertain. Doctors carried bamboo cases filled with powders, roots, and scrolls. They spoke of yin and yang, the balance of hot and cold, wet and dry, light and dark within the body. Illness was seen not as an invading germ, but as imbalance, disharmony between the body and the universe. Herbal remedies were everywhere. Ginseng promised strength, ginger warmed the blood, chrysanthemum cooled fevers. Acupuncture needles pricked the skin in delicate patterns, believed to release blocked energy. Cupping, moxibustion, and massage offered further attempts at restoring balance. Sometimes these treatments brought relief. Other times they did nothing at all. For the poor, medicine was rarely more than boiled herbs or prayers whispered to ancestors. Village healers mixed remedies from weeds, bark, and river stones, their knowledge passed down by word of mouth. Hope was often stronger than the cure. The wealthy, however, summoned physicians trained in the classics, who prescribed elaborate treatments and expensive ingredients, powdered pearls, rare animal parts, even mercury or arsenic in small amounts. Such medicines carried as much risk as relief, and yet medicine was never just about the body. It was about belief. A patient who trusted his healer, who felt the ritual of treatment, sometimes recovered by faith alone. The mind gave strength where herbs could not. Traditional medicine in Imperial China was not useless, but it was fragile, an art of survival in a world that did not yet understand the true enemies it faced. For the common man, it was not a guarantee of life, only a flicker of hope against the endless shadow of disease. In Imperial China, the cry of a newborn was both a blessing and a gamble. For every child born, there was no certainty they would live to see adulthood. Child mortality was a shadow that haunted every household. Diseases struck without mercy. Infants weakened by poor nutrition fell to fevers and coughs. Smallpox scarred, or killed many before they could even walk. Diarrhea, now easily cured, drained life from countless toddlers. A simple cut could turn deadly without medicine to stop infection. For poor families, hunger sharpened the danger. Mothers, themselves malnourished, struggled to produce milk. Rice gruel or millet porridge replaced breast milk too early, leaving children frail. In years of famine, families made impossible choices, feeding the strongest while the weakest quietly slipped away. And then came the sorrow of daughters. In a world where sons were prized as heirs, some girls were abandoned or sold. Others were raised, but always with the knowledge that they would one day leave the household, bringing little to its future. Sons carried the family name and honored the ancestors. Daughters were seen as temporary guests. Yet for those who survived, childhood was brief. By the age of 6 or 7, children of peasants joined their parents in the fields, their small hands pulling weeds, carrying water, or tending animals. Childhood was not innocence, it was labor, and survival was never guaranteed. Every funeral for a child was a wound carved into the family, yet it was so common that sorrow became a shared language. Some families spoke of it as fate, others as heaven's will, others as karma from past lives. To be a child in Imperial China was to walk a path lined with danger. Many never reached its end, and those who did carried the grief of siblings lost along the way. Childhood was not promise, it was a fragile chance. In Imperial China, life was short. To live past 40 was considered good fortune. To see 50 or 60 was remarkable. The average peasant, worn down by labor, hunger, and disease, rarely reached old age. From birth, danger stalked every step. Many children never survived infancy. Those who did faced constant risks, malnutrition, infections, epidemics, and the crushing demands of work. A farmer's body, bent double from plowing, fields since childhood, often broke down by middle age. Teeth rotted, joints stiffened, and illnesses untreated grew into lifelong burdens. For women, life was even more precarious. Childbirth was perilous, with little knowledge of hygiene or medicine to protect mother or child. Many women died young, their lives spent in cycles of pregnancy, labor, and recovery that never truly ended. The wealthy fared better, sheltered by softer lives, richer diets, and access to physicians. Some emperors lived into their 70s, yet even they were not safe from disease, poisons, or the endless intrigues of court life. Palaces may have been gilded, but death still entered their gates. Old age, when it came, carried both respect and weight. Elders were revered, their wisdom honored, their presence essential in ancestral rites. But few families had the chance to care for aging parents. Too often, death carried them before their hair turned white. Life in Imperial China was a race against time, and time rarely gave mercy. To live long was not expected, but celebrated as a rare blessing. For most, the story of life ended far sooner than we would ever imagine today. Another reminder that survival itself was the empire's greatest challenge. In Imperial China, wounds of the body were treated with herbs and needles, but wounds of the mind, those were left in silence. Mental health, as we understand it today, had no name, no category, no safe space. A man crushed by grief, a woman weighed down by despair, a soldier haunted by battles. These were not seen as people in need of care, but as weak, cursed, or possessed. Families hid them away, ashamed to admit that the mind could break just as easily as bone. Some turned to religion for answers. Buddhist monks spoke of suffering as part of the cycle of life, urging meditation, prayer, and acceptance. Taoist priests offered rituals, charms, or exorcisms to drive out evil spirits believed to cause madness. These practices gave comfort to some, but rarely relief. The wealthy sometimes sought physicians who diagnosed imbalances of qi, prescribing herbs, diets, or acupuncture. Yet for most, there was no treatment at all. The afflicted wandered streets, chained in homes or left to fate. Their cries echoed, but society rarely listened, and still, people endured. Stories and poems hint at melancholy, at sorrow so deep it could not be spoken. Scholars wrote of isolation and despair cloaked in metaphor. Farmers carried their burdens quietly, their struggles hidden beneath endless labor. Mental suffering was everywhere, but always in the shadows. It had no language, no recognition, no cure. To live in Imperial China was to face not only the fragility of the body, but the silence of the mind. Pain endured alone, behind walls of ritual and obedience. In a world where survival left little room for weakness, the heart's quiet cries were drowned out by the empire's demands. While peasants bent under the sun in fields of mud, a very different world existed behind carved gates and silk curtains. For the elite of Imperial China, life was woven from luxury, a world so distant from the commoners that it seemed another universe entirely. Their homes were not huts, but sprawling courtyards, with tiled roofs curling like waves and walls painted in brilliant reds and golds. Gardens bloomed with peonies and lotus ponds, where koi fish glimmered beneath the water. Servants bustled silently, carrying trays of porcelain bowls, their movements choreographed like ritual. The tables of the wealthy overflowed. Where peasants ate thin porridge, nobles dined on pork, duck, and delicate dumplings, seasoned with spices carried from faraway lands. Tea was not necessity but art, poured with elegance, served in cups so fine they were translucent. Their clothing shimmered with silk, embroidered with dragons and phoenixes. Golden hairpins held elaborate hairstyles in place, while jade ornaments clinked softly at their belts. Every thread and jewel whispered status, but luxury was not only material, it was time. The wealthy wrote poetry, painted landscapes, and played zithers beneath lantern light. Scholars discussed philosophy in shaded pavilions, while their servants fanned them against the summer heat. Pleasure was not hurried but savored, yet beneath the beauty lay fragility. All this wealth existed only because millions labored to sustain it. The silk, the jade, the porcelain, none of it came from the hands of nobles. It was extracted from those who would never taste its fruits. To live as an elite in Imperial China was to dwell in a dream of abundance, yet one built upon the hunger of others. Their world sparkled like gold, but it rested on foundations of mud. At the pinnacle of Imperial China stood one man, the Emperor, the Son of Heaven. His authority was absolute, his word the law of the land. To his subjects he was more than a ruler. He was a cosmic figure, a bridge between heaven and earth. The emperor's day began not with leisure but with ritual. Courtiers and officials lined up in vast halls, bowing until their foreheads struck stone floors. They waited for hours just to hear a single command, a single word that could decide the fate of provinces, armies, or families. With a brushstroke, the emperor could order canals dug, armies raised, palaces built. With a nod, he could promote a scholar to glory, or condemn him to exile and ruin. No courtier, no general, no minister was beyond his reach. His power stretched into every corner of the empire, from the gilded palaces of Beijing to the smallest hut in a distant village. But absolute power was also a prison. The emperor lived within the forbidden city, its walls as confining as they were protective. Every meal was tasted for poison. Every servant was a pair of watchful eyes. Even his family could not be trusted. Sons became rivals, concubines plotted. Eunuchs whispered in corridors. To show weakness was unthinkable. An emperor might be racked by illness, grief, or doubt, but before the empire he remained untouchable, divine. Behind the silks and ceremonies, many emperors lived in fear. Fear of betrayal, of rebellion, of heaven itself withdrawing its mandate. For the people, the emperor was both protector and tyrant. His name was spoken with reverence, but also with dread. His face, glimpsed only in portraits, was a symbol of majesty, but also of distance, for he would never know their hunger, their labor, their lives. The emperor's throne was the highest seat in the empire, but also the loneliest. To rule all was to trust none, to hold absolute power yet live in absolute isolation. Behind the crimson walls of the forbidden city, power did not belong only to the emperor. It also pulsed through the quiet, silken chambers of the women of the palace, his empress, his concubines, and the countless attendants who lived in shadows yet shaped dynasties. To be chosen as a concubine was both a blessing and a curse. Girls were plucked from noble families, sometimes even from modest homes, and brought into the palace. Draped in silk, they seemed to rise above ordinary life, but in truth they entered a world of endless rivalry. A concubine's worth was measured by one thing: her ability to bear the emperor a son. Those who succeeded gained favor, titles, even wealth for their families. Those who failed faded into obscurity, trapped in gilded cages where whispers and glances decided their fate. Life inside was a game of survival. Concubines competed fiercely for the emperor's attention, forging alliances with eunuchs and courtiers, spreading rumors to weaken rivals. Poison slipped into teacups, accusations whispered in the dark. These were weapons as sharp as swords. The empress stood above them all, her position secure yet always precarious. If she fell from grace, even she could be cast aside. Many stories tell of women who ruled from behind the throne, their whispers guiding emperors, their sons inheriting the mandate of heaven. But just as many ended in tragedy, banished, imprisoned, or executed when fortunes shifted. For palace women, beauty was power, but also a prison. Their lives were luxurious yet suffocating, surrounded by jewels and jade, yet stripped of freedom. They lived not for themselves, but for the empire, their bodies vessels of dynasty, their futures tied to the favor of one man. In the eyes of history, they were shadows behind the emperor. But within the palace walls, they were storm winds, silent, unseen, and capable of reshaping the empire itself. Inside the forbidden city, the empire was not ruled only in grand halls but in whispers. Court intrigue was the true pulse of power. Schemes and betrayals woven into the daily life of ministers, generals, eunuchs, and palace women. Officials arrived at dawn with scrolls of petitions, but decisions were not always made by merit. Bribes slid across lacquered tables, secret alliances bloomed in corridors, and rivals sharpened their knives with words rather than steel. To rise in court was to walk a tightrope above an abyss, every step watched, every stumble fatal. The eunuchs, once mere servants, often became kingmakers. Trusted with secrets controlling access to the emperor, they wielded invisible daggers. Many officials despised them, yet none dared ignore their influence. One whispered word in the emperor's ear could end a career or a life. Paranoia seeped into every chamber. A scholar who spoke too boldly risked exile. A general who won too many victories risked suspicion of treason. Even brothers and sons could become rivals, each eyeing the throne with ambition. The empire's glittering court was as much a battlefield as any frontier, but its weapons were intrigue, slander, and betrayal, and above it all sat the emperor, both master and prisoner of this web. Some manipulated it with brilliance, turning factions against each other. Others drowned in it, overwhelmed by lies, unable to see truth until rebellion consumed their dynasty. For the common people, the court was a distant dream, a world of elegance and ceremony. But within its walls it was a cage of daggers where loyalty was rare, treachery constant, and survival depended not on honor, but cunning. The empire was built on order, but its heart beat with betrayal. And it was often these hidden intrigues, not foreign invasions, that determined whether a dynasty would endure or fall. The splendor of imperial China dazzled with silks, jade, and porcelain, but beneath every treasure lay the truth. Wealth was built on the backs of the poor. The comforts of the elite were carved from the suffering of millions who toiled unseen. When nobles sipped fragrant teas in porcelain cups, peasants had carried the leaves through steep mountains, their hands raw from picking. When court ladies draped themselves in embroidered silk, it was spun by village women hunched over looms, their eyes strained by candlelight. When palaces rose with towering walls and golden roofs, it was farmers, conscripts, and convicts who bled in the mud to raise them. The taxes that funded luxury were squeezed from villages already starving. Grain meant for families was diverted to granaries, filling the stomachs of officials while children went hungry. Labor meant for fields was pulled into imperial projects, leaving crops untended, harvests lost. Even merchants, though despised, in rank, fed the wealth of the elite. Their caravans and ships brought foreign luxuries, gems, spices, ivory, that only nobles could afford. The gap between rich and poor widened with every trade. Yet for the elite, this imbalance was not shame, but order. Confucian philosophy taught that each class had its place, and the suffering of peasants was simply the foundation of harmony. The empire's glittering beauty was possible only because the common people bore its weight without choice. For a peasant, looking up at palace walls, the wealth of the elite was not distant, it was personal. Every missing grain, every tax collected, every day of forced labor was a stone in the courtyard of the powerful. Imperial China's luxury was not free. It was extracted, demanded, enforced. And while history remembers the jade and gold, it is built on a truth harder than stone. Behind every jewel was a hand that starved. In Imperial China, the narrowest doorway to power was the imperial examination system. It was the dream of countless families, the hope that a son, armed only with ink and memory, might rise from obscurity to become an official, lifting his entire lineage with him. The exams were legendary for their difficulty. Candidates memorized the Confucian classics word for word, reciting passages that filled entire libraries. They learned to compose elegant essays, weaving philosophy and morality into perfect patterns of ink. It was not creativity the exam demanded, but obedience, proof that a man could think as the empire wanted him to think. Examinations were grueling ordeals. In cities across the empire, candidates were locked in tiny cubicles for days at a time, eating, sleeping, and writing in the same cramped space. The air stank of ink, sweat, and desperation. Failure was almost certain. Out of thousands, only a handful passed, their names read aloud as if heaven itself had chosen them. For the few who succeeded, doors opened to honor, wealth, and power. Their families celebrated for generations, but for the many who failed, there was only disappointment, poverty, and shame. Some tried again and again, spending decades chasing the dream. Others went mad under the weight of failure, their lives consumed by books that brought no reward. The imperial exams were the empire's greatest promise and its greatest trap. They gave hope to peasants and scholars alike, yet they reinforced the very hierarchy they pretended to break. In Imperial China, the exam system was more than a test. It was the empire's leash, binding ambition to obedience, ensuring that even the brightest minds served not themselves, but the throne. In Imperial China, words were power, but they were also chains. Literacy was a rare gift, held tightly in the hands of the few, and for those who bore it, the weight could be crushing. Most peasants lived and died without ever holding a brush. Their knowledge was the soil, the seasons, the feel of the plough, in their hands. But for the sons of scholars and the wealthy, life was bound to paper and ink. From childhood, they bent over desks, their backs aching, their fingers stained black, memorizing line after line of Confucian texts. To read was not freedom, it was duty. Literacy tied you to the endless pursuit of the imperial examinations, a path that could consume your youth and leave you with nothing but failure. Families pinned their hopes on a boy's success, and if he stumbled, shame fell not only on him but on generations. Books did not teach rebellion or imagination. They reinforced obedience. The written word was a mirror of the state, reflecting the values of hierarchy, loyalty, and submission. To write boldly, to think freely was dangerous. A single phrase judged improper could destroy a career, or worse, condemn its writer. And so literacy was both a ladder and a trap. It promised the chance to climb higher than birth, but demanded absolute conformity in return. To wield words was to carry the empire on your shoulders, to serve not truth but order. In imperial China, the ability to read was not a path to independence. It was the empire's way of binding bright minds into its service, making sure that those who could write the future never dared to write against it. In imperial China, knowledge was not a river flowing freely. It was a dammed reservoir, controlled by the state. What could be written, what could be read, what could even be spoken, was shaped by censorship. The empire feared words as much as weapons. A poem with the wrong tone, a book with the wrong ideas, even a phrase that hinted at criticism, could be seen as rebellion. Scholars lived in terror of their own ink, weighing each word as if it were life or death, because often it was. Imperial libraries were filled with the classics of Confucius and histories of dynasties past, but dangerous books, texts that challenged authority, foreign philosophies, even alternative histories, were banned or destroyed. In some dynasties, especially under harsh rulers like Qin Shi Huang centuries earlier, vast burnings of books took place. Entire traditions of thought reduced to ash. Even commoners were watched. Storytellers in markets, singers in tea houses, playwrights in small village theatres, all knew that too sharp a joke, too bold a criticism, might bring soldiers to drag them away. The empire's control stretched not only into palaces, but into the very words spoken in the street. And yet censorship never killed thought entirely. Ideas survived in whispers, hidden manuscripts or secret teachings passed between master and student. Some scholars cloaked their dissent in allegory, disguising critique as fables about mountains and rivers, foxes and tigers. Still, the message was clear. Knowledge belonged not to the people, but to the emperor. Words could inspire, unite, and rebel, and so the state smothered them, allowing only those that reinforced its power. In imperial China, the pen was never free. It was chained, its ink carefully watched, its paper serving the empire's will. To write was to risk, to speak was to gamble. Silence for many was the only safe story. In imperial China, to speak against authority was not bravery, it was suicide. Dissent was a crime the empire never forgave. A scholar who dared to question an imperial decree, even with careful words, risked everything. His writings could be condemned as treason. His family disgraced, his ancestors shamed, his descendants barred from office. For the empire, punishing one dissenter was not just justice, it was a warning to thousands. Punishments for dissent were brutal. A careless phrase could mean exile to the cold frontiers, where survival was little more than a slow death. Harsher cases brought flogging, imprisonment, or execution, and dissent was never personal, it was collective. Entire families could be punished for one man's words, ensuring silence spread from father to son, mother to daughter. Artists, too, lived in fear. A painter who strayed too far from accepted themes, a playwright who wrote satire with too sharp a tongue, a singer whose ballad mocked corruption, all risked vanishing into prison or worse. In the empire's eyes, even laughter could be rebellion if it pointed upward. Yet dissent never disappeared completely. Some scholars cloaked their criticisms in allegory, writing of rivers that changed course, of suns that dimmed, of animals who ruled unwisely. The wise could read between the lines, but officials too knew how to listen for hidden meanings. It was a dangerous game. The empire demanded harmony, but harmony enforced by terror was silence. To dissent was to gamble not only with your own life but with the lives of those you loved, and so most bowed their heads, swallowed their words, and lived in quiet obedience. For in Imperial China, truth was not a shield, it was a blade, and it cut down those who dared to wield it. Despite censorship and fear, Imperial China produced some of the world's most enduring art and literature. Beauty blossomed even in chains, though it always carried the mark of the empire's control. Scholars wrote poetry that painted landscapes with words, mountains shrouded in mist, rivers flowing endlessly, the quiet of bamboo groves. But these verses were rarely just about nature. They were reflections of the soul, coded whispers of longing, sorrow, or even resistance hidden in allegory. A poem about a withered tree might be about an aging official. A verse on autumn winds might mourn a fallen dynasty. Painters brushed, scrolls with ink, capturing the spirit of the world rather than its exact form. Mountains rose in sweeping strokes. Waterfalls tumbled in mist. Solitary figures walked in silence. The emptiness of the canvas was as important as the ink itself, reflecting Taoist ideals of balance and harmony. Yet, art too was confined. Court. Painters often created not for themselves, but to glorify emperors and dynasties. Literature flourished in novels and plays, though often at the edges of official approval. Tales of wandering heroes, of ghosts and lovers, of corrupt officials mocked in satire, all entertained the common people in markets and tea-houses, but playwrights risked punishment if their humor cut too close to truth. Calligraphy itself was considered art, every brushstroke a measure of character. To write beautifully was not just a skill, but a sign of moral refinement. Words became pictures, and pictures became a reflection of the soul. Yet, beneath the beauty, lingered silence. Art and literature thrived, but always under the watchful eye of authority. Creativity was permitted, but only within invisible boundaries. The artist's brush could soar like a crane, but its wings were always clipped by the empire's hand. In Imperial China, art was not rebellion, it was survival. A way to express the human spirit, carefully, delicately, within the narrow lines drawn by power. For all its walls and armies, Imperial China lived in constant fear of the nomads of the north. From the endless steppes came riders on horseback, swift, ruthless and unpredictable. To the settled empire they were both terror and mirror, everything China was not, yet could never escape. The nomads lived in motion, herding animals, hunting, moving with the seasons. They struck like storms, appearing suddenly on the horizon with bows drawn, their arrows darkening the sky. To farmers bound to their fields, they seemed unstoppable, ghosts of the grasslands who answered to no emperor. Dynasties rose and fell in their shadow. The Xiongnu, the Mongols, the Manchus, all at different times pressed upon China's borders, demanding tribute, plundering villages, or conquering outright. The Great Wall itself was less a symbol of strength than a monument to fear, an admission that the empire could never truly tame its neighbors. For peasants near the frontier, invasion meant devastation. Crops burned, homes looted, families carried away as captives. Soldiers stationed on the border lived lives of constant dread, their armor rusting in harsh weather, their pay often stolen by corrupt officials. Yet the empire also depended on the nomads. Horses, wool, and trade from the steppe flowed into China, and emperors often chose diplomacy over war, marrying princesses to nomadic leaders, sending silks and silver in exchange for fragile peace. To the Chinese elite, the nomads were barbarians, wild, uncivilized, a threat to order. But to the peasants, they were simply terror-made flesh, reminders that the empire, for all its grandeur, was never as secure as it claimed. In Imperial China, danger did not only come from within, it thundered across the grasslands, riding fast. Horses carrying the promise that even the greatest walls could not keep the world away. Among all the nomadic threats, none struck Imperial China as hard or left as deep a scar as the Mongols. In the 13th century, The riders of the steppe swept down like a storm, led by Genghis Khan and his descendants, their banners snapping in the wind. No dynasty could withstand them. Cities burned, armies shattered, millions perished. When the dust settled, China was ruled by foreigners. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, stood as proof that even the mighty empire could be conquered. For the first time, the Son of Heaven was not Chinese, but Mongol. Life under Mongol rule was harsh and humiliating. The conquerors placed themselves above all others, granting privilege to their own people, while treating Han Chinese as second-class subjects. Government positions were often denied to native scholars who had spent lifetimes studying for exams that suddenly meant little. Farmers endured the same crushing taxes, but now their labor fed an empire that did not even speak their tongue. The Mongols, masters of the horse and bow, cared little for China's rituals and traditions. Their laws were fierce, their punishments swift. Rebellion was met with mass slaughter, whole towns reduced to ash. Fear hung heavy in the air, and yet the empire endured, bent under foreign rule. But the Mongols also left legacies. They expanded trade across Eurasia, connecting China to distant lands as never before. Caravans carried silk and porcelain westward, bringing back glass, spices, and ideas. For a moment, the world grew smaller under Mongol hooves. Still, when the Yuan dynasty finally fell, driven out by rebellion and famine, the memory of their rule lingered as both a wound and a warning. To the Chinese, it was proof that even heaven's mandate could be stolen by outsiders, that the empire's walls were never truly unbreakable. In imperial China, the Mongols were not just invaders. They were a shadow that haunted dynasties long. After they were gone, a reminder that the empire's greatness could be shattered and reshaped by foreign hands. The Silk Road is remembered as a glittering artery of trade, carrying silk, porcelain, and spices from China to distant lands, and bringing back glass, gems, and wonders from beyond the desert. But for those who traveled it, the road was less a promise and more a peril. Merchants set out with caravans of camels, their loads heavy with treasures. They dreamed of profit, but each step carried risk. Bandits lurked among the dunes and mountain passes, swift to strike and ruthless in plunder. A single ambush could strip a trader not only of wealth, but of life. The land itself was a merciless enemy. The Taklamakan Desert, its name whispered as the place of no return, swallowed travelers in endless waves of sand. The Gobi froze with deadly cold, while mountain paths crumbled beneath weary feet. Storms struck without warning, turning journeys into graves. Even when merchants survived, they faced the dangers of foreign lands. Local rulers demanded tribute, taxes, or bribes. Language barriers led to disputes. Trade turned to theft. Strangers became foes. The Silk Road connected empires, but it also exposed China to influences the rulers feared: new ideas, foreign religions, and unknown powers. For the emperor, the Silk Road was a source of wealth and prestige, proof of China's place at the center of the world. But it was also a breach in the empire's walls, a channel through which danger could slip. Foreign envoys brought tribute, but also spies. Goods carried wealth, but also disease. To the ordinary merchant, the Silk Road was never a romantic adventure. It was hardship, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Each mile walked was a gamble, each trade a test of survival. In imperial China, the Silk Road was not just a road of silk. It was a road of bones, paved with the lives of those who sought fortune and found only death. For centuries, imperial China saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, surrounded by lesser barbarian lands. This belief was not pride alone. It shaped policy, culture, and the very way China dealt with the outside world. Foreigners were often viewed with suspicion. Their languages were strange, their clothes unrefined, their customs uncivilized. Even when they brought goods of value, they were treated as outsiders, kept at a distance, managed through tribute, never fully welcomed. The empire believed it needed nothing from beyond its borders. At times, isolation became official policy. Ports were closed, foreign trade restricted, travelers forbidden to leave. The Ming dynasty famously sent out grand fleets under Admiral Zheng He, only to later burn the ships, ending an age of exploration before it truly began. To the rulers, looking outward was dangerous, looking inward was safe. Xenophobia also carried fear. Foreign ideas, religions like Christianity, philosophies from the West or technologies from abroad were seen as potential threats to harmony. To preserve order, emperors tightened control, ensuring that China remained insulated even as the wider world advanced. For the common people, foreigners were curiosities, sometimes feared, sometimes admired, often distrusted. A foreign merchant in a marketplace might attract stares, but rarely acceptance. Those who settled in China were bound by strict rules, their movements watched, their influence contained. Isolation gave the empire stability, shielding it from some dangers of invasion and cultural upheaval, but it also bred stagnation, leaving China unprepared when, centuries later, the outside world would force its way in with cannons and treaties. In imperial China, the walls were not only of stone, they were of the mind, walls of suspicion, walls of fear, walls built to keep the empire untouched, even as the world beyond moved on. In imperial China, foreign relations were not about equality. They were about tribute. To approach the emperor, even as a ruler of another land, was to acknowledge China as the center of the world and yourself as a lesser. Envoys from distant kingdoms arrived at the capital bearing gifts, horses, gems, ivory, spices, even slaves. They bowed low, sometimes performing the kowtow, knocking their heads against the floor before the Son of Heaven. Only then were they permitted to trade or negotiate, their own rulers reduced to the role of supplicants. To the Chinese court, this was not arrogance but order. The emperor was the pivot of civilization, and all other nations revolved around him. The tribute system was less about what gifts were given and more about what message was affirmed. China was supreme. But diplomacy was also pragmatic. Tribute kept borders secure, bought peace with nomads, and opened channels of trade without admitting weakness. To the empire, silver from Japan, horses from Mongolia, or spices from Southeast Asia were welcome, as long as they arrived in the form of submission. For foreign rulers, the system was humiliating but often necessary. To defy China was to risk war with an empire of millions. To play by its rules meant profit, access to markets, and sometimes delicate alliances. Many swallowed pride for survival. For common Chinese, tribute missions were curiosities. Foreigners, in strange clothes, speaking strange tongues, parading exotic animals through the streets, proof, they believed, that the whole world bent knee to their emperor. Yet beneath the rituals lay fragility. Tribute secured peace only as long as China was strong. When dynasties weakened, envoys vanished, borders erupted, and the illusion of eternal supremacy crumbled. In imperial China, diplomacy was not negotiation, it was theater. A performance of submission that masked the empire's fears, projecting strength to the world even as it sometimes trembled within. Imagine waking up in imperial China. Before you even open your eyes, your life is already decided. Who you are, what you will do, how far you can rise, all of it is carved into the empire's rigid hierarchy, and there is no escape. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant. Your hands would know only soil, your back only labor. If you were a woman, your destiny was sealed in obedience, first to your father, then your husband, then your son. Even wealth could not free you if you were a merchant. Your silver bought goods, but never respect. This order was enforced not just by law but by belief. Confucian teachings told you that this was harmony, that to challenge your place was to challenge the cosmos itself. Rituals reminded you daily of your inferiority, how low you bowed, where you stood in a room, what clothes you were allowed to wear. The hierarchy was not simply social, it was spiritual. The emperor ruled by the mandate of heaven, his officials by the emperor's will, and you at the bottom by necessity. To step out of line was to step into danger. There was no ladder to climb, no dream to chase. The walls of society were higher than the Great Wall itself, and thicker than the palace gates. For modern eyes, used to freedom and choice, imperial China would feel like suffocation. You were not an individual. You were a role, a cog, a shadow, in a system that demanded obedience. In such a world, survival was not about ambition or hope. It was about knowing your place, never rising, never resisting, and never forgetting that in the Empire's eyes you were not yourself, you were only your station. In Imperial China, the very idea of individual rights did not exist. The Empire was everything. The person was nothing. Your life belonged to the Emperor. Your labor belonged to the state. Your body, even your death, could be commanded by decree. If officials ordered you to build a wall, dig a canal, or march to war, you obeyed, or you suffered. There were no courts to defend your freedom, no laws written for your protection. Law existed to maintain order, not justice. Punishments were brutal, often collective. If you spoke against the throne, not only you but your family could be destroyed. Guilt was shared like a shadow, ensuring silence spread through generations. Even your property was uncertain. A good harvest might be seized as tax, your land taken by a landlord or corrupted magistrate. A single accusation could strip you of everything you owned. Rights were not guaranteed. They were privileges granted or revoked at the will of those above. For women, the absence of rights was even sharper. They had no voice in law, no independence in marriage, no choice in their futures. Their lives were measured in service, first as daughters, then wives, then mothers. And yet this system was not seen as cruelty, but as harmony. The Empire claimed that if everyone fulfilled their role, society would flourish. But harmony for the Empire meant submission for the people. To live in Imperial China was to live without the protections we take for granted. Freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of movement, none of these existed. The Empire owned your life and you were expected to be grateful. For a modern soul, such a world would feel unbearable. But for those who lived it, there was no alternative. The Empire was the air they breathed, and there was no escaping its reach. In Imperial China, survival was never secure. It balanced on the edge of a blade, swayed by forces no one could control. One drought, one flood, one decree from above. Any of these could tip a family from life into ruin. A farmer might work from dawn to dusk, coaxing rice from the soil, yet a single storm could wash it all away. The tax collector would still arrive, demanding grain that no longer existed. Hunger would creep in like a thief, stealing strength from the old and life from the young. Even when the skies were kind, survival was fragile. Bandits roamed the countryside. Soldiers conscripted men without warning. Disease spread through villages with invisible hands. There was no safety net, no relief waiting for those who fell. The Empire was vast, but its hand was heavy, not protective. Families learned to endure with resilience, but they also lived with constant fear. A good year could vanish in an instant. A child's laughter could be silenced by sickness overnight. A village could be thriving one season, abandoned the next. The fragility of survival was not only physical, but psychological. People carried the weight of uncertainty every day. They prayed to ancestors, burned incense, watched the heavens for omens, seeking any sign that tomorrow might be kinder than today. For us today, the idea of such precarious living is almost unimaginable. But for those in Imperial China, it was simply life. A daily struggle against forces too vast to fight, endured with patience because there was no other choice. In such a world, you would not last a day, not because of weakness, but because survival demanded endurance beyond what most modern hearts could bear. In Imperial China, fear was everywhere. Not just fear of hunger, not just fear of disease, but fear of the law itself. Punishment was not rare. It was the Empire's language of control. From the moment you were born, you knew the rules were unyielding. To disobey your parents was shameful. To disobey your landlord was dangerous. To disobey the emperor was fatal. The chain of authority stretched from heaven itself down to the smallest village, and breaking even a single link could bring disaster. Officials wielded the law like a whip. A minor theft might earn lashes across the back. A tax left unpaid could bring prison or exile. Crimes of rebellion or defiance invited horrors, beheadings in crowded squares, executions designed not only to kill, but to terrify. Families of the accused were punished too, reminding everyone that guilt was never solitary. The empire did not seek justice, it sought obedience. Every punishment, every public execution, every whispered warning was meant to carve fear into the hearts of millions. And it worked. People bowed lower, spoke softer, obeyed quicker, not out of respect, but out of terror. Even the innocent lived under this shadow. A careless word overheard by the wrong ear, a neighbor's false accusation, a corrupt official's greed, all could drag you into the pit of punishment. No one was ever safe. For us today, the fear of constant surveillance and merciless judgment would be unbearable. But for the people of Imperial China, it was simply life. They learned to walk carefully, speak cautiously, and hide their thoughts. In silence. In such a world, fear was not a passing feeling. It was air itself, breathed in every moment, filling every life with the weight of submission. Now, step back. The walls of the forbidden city fade. The fields of rice vanish. The drums of armies fall silent. We look upon Imperial China not as its people lived it, but as history remembers it. Grand, majestic, yet merciless. It was a civilization of breathtaking achievements, silk and porcelain, poetry and philosophy, palaces and canals that defied imagination. But beneath its splendor lay hunger, fear, and endless toil. For every emperor draped in yellow silk, millions bent their backs in muddy fields. For every poem written in ink, countless voices were silenced by law. For every jewel in the emperor's crown, a family starved to pay its cost. To live in Imperial China was not to live freely, it was to endure. Your birth decided your station, your survival balanced on fragile harvests, your silence demanded by a system that valued harmony over humanity. Life was short, uncertain, and often cruel. And yet, the people endured. They sang songs at festivals, lit lanterns against the dark, honored ancestors, whispered prayers, and dreamed of better days. Even in the harshest world, the human spirit flickered, fragile but unextinguished. Looking back, we see both glory and suffering, both wisdom and cruelty. We marvel at the empire's endurance, but we also recognize a truth. For most who lived within it, survival was the greatest triumph. This is why you would not last a day in Imperial China, not because you are weak, but because the world was merciless, demanding strength beyond imagination, a strength born of hunger, silence, obedience, and fear, a strength we no longer need to endure. And so the story of Imperial China closes, a land of wonder and hardship, a reminder of how far humanity has come, and how fragile life once was under the shadow of the Son of Heaven.